My name is already taken.
All right, so we get started. Quite a few announcements. The first one being that all of your grades should be up to date on Canvas at this point, so you should all have everything you've submitted graded, and you should have feedback. The exams are graded. You should each have a PDF with like the annotations and stuff and feedback on it. Just it's as a comment on the exam. But if there's something you have that's not graded, or I've made a grading mistake because I do math wrong sometimes, or sometimes I get off by a row or a column, let me know, and I'm more than happy to make sure it's right in Canvas. Overall, everybody's grades look really good. Definitely nobody in danger of failing this class, and pretty much everybody is doing very well. Okay, homework 3 is due on Thursday, so please get that in. Also, I've added a project team dynamics survey, and that's due by Thursday. This is not for a grade, so if you really don't want to tell me about your team, you don't have to. But this will let me know kind of how things are going with the group project and your team, and if everybody is contributing, and kind of just get some insight there. All of this is, like, I'm not going to share your responses with anyone or anything. It's just for me to know. And we'll talk about the project a little bit more in just a second. Exam 3, I'm planning to kind of default that to a take-home exam again. It will be, I'm trying to make it an easy exam for you. Because I want you to have time to focus on your projects, and I know you're going to have a lot of other stuff going on with other classes and exams. So exam 3, I will do my best to make it meaningful, but still brief, and a take-home exam. So I'll show you the calendar on that. If you don't want it to be a take-home exam, let me know, and we can find a time for you to sit down and take it. For grad students, the paper review assignments are posted on Canvas now. So basically, you have to review two conference papers or journal articles and write that up. If you have questions, let me know. And final projects presentations are only 3 weeks away, so that's exciting. Okay, so rest of the semester, we're here right now. Here's what I'm planning to do. So your homework will be due, homework 3 will be due on Thursday. We'll also have a quiz on Thursday. I'm trying to get all the quizzes out of the way. If you remember, I am dropping 2 quiz grades, your lowest ones. And if you have been here and made a good faith effort to, take the quizzes, I'm not going to let the quizzes hurt your grade, like in a bad way. So I know, like, some of these latest ones, people have gotten confused on a few items, and there's not a lot of items on the quiz. Don't worry too much about that. The quizzes are mostly just to make sure you're staying up to date with what we're doing. But we'll have a couple more. And then on Thursday, we'll do social HCI, which will kind of be a primer for all of the things that everyone chose for our special topics lectures. So it'll cover a lot of the basics that we need to talk about these other things. So after that, next week, we will do kind of these 2 special topics class periods. And then on Thursday, I'll post exam 3. It will be due technically on the 23rd, but I am not going to look at it until the 2nd. I can't really assign you anything that's due after classes end. So it will be an exam that you can do within 75 minutes. But I know this is like a holiday weekend and everything, and you have lots of other stuff going on. So this is not a hard deadline, but it is the recommended deadline. I think you should definitely aim to have it done by then. It's just that I want to be able to get some of these topics in the exam, so I can't really release it until this point. But then, our last class is ready. So, yeah.
You know if the 24th is also reading day too, or is that a full class?
I think it's a full class day, because I think only the 25th said reading day. No. So, I had my final things good. Okay, but anyways, the 23rd will be our last day of class, and I'll do kind of a summary and kind of a broader discussion of HCI and some of current research and future stuff. If for some reason you have a bunch of other things, you don't have to be here for this class, but I'd like it if you were here. Or if you want to take your exam during that time, you're welcome to do that too. And then our final presentations will be on the 30th, April 30th. And so I'll put out a detailed description of what you need to do for final presentations and how they're organized. I'll do that on Thursday. We'll talk about it a little bit more then. But it'll be from 12 to 3 in this room. And you will need to get me your presentation material that day, earlier in the day. But if you, for like your documentation and your final code and everything, I'm making May 2nd the cutoff for kind of all your materials. So anything you haven't turned in that you want to turn in, I have to have grades in on the 6th in the morning. So I think this is probably the most reasonable cutoff I can do and still be able to send you an email if something is wrong or something and try to get it sorted out before grades are due. So does this schedule seem okay to everyone? Are there any questions, problems? Okay, cool. Good deal. So briefly, let's talk about the final project, because I know we have a lot of questions on it and what the actual requirements are. So I'll send out on Thursday a detailed breakdown of grading and everything and how that's going to be done. I'll tell you that all the groups so far have full credit for everything they've done in the project up until this point. But that's less than half of the project grade. So about half of the project grade is this final presentation. So the main thing that I'd like you to focus on is obviously to be comprehensive and meet all of the requirements for whatever project you're working on. Incorporate feedback from FedEx and user evaluations. But mostly, it's important that you make something that's usable, presentable, and then something that we can hand off to FedEx and still be useful to them. And so one of the big questions that people have been asking is coding or programming required? It's not. I think it's probably the easiest and best way to make an interactive prototype, and I certainly encourage it. But if your group is stretched thin or doesn't have the experience to do it, or you are having a better experience using some other tool that's not programming, that's fine. So also I should say, if you would like to, you don't necessarily have to do your entire project in the same framework, the same programming language, the same design software. So if you want to, if there's one specific element of your app that you think would benefit from implementing in, HTML and JavaScript or something, and you want to just make an interactive demo of that isolated element, that's fine too. You can do this however you need to do this. Traditionally, people end up programming something, but this year or this semester we've had a lot of design tools that we've looked at. There are a lot of new things out there, and I'm certainly open to you doing that. What we really are focused on is HCI, so the interaction with the interface, the concept of how the interface is going to work, and communicating that. So I don't want you to have to waste your time programming something that's either you're going to spend all your time learning some framework or doing something that's not going to actually focus on the HCI, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers that question. What will we send to FedEx? So part of your project will be to package up whatever it is you produce and write documentation on how FedEx can run it or use it. And so we will send all of those files and that documentation. How this will be graded exactly, I will give you that breakdown on Thursday. It'll be pretty straightforward. Documentation is 10%, I think. Your final presentation is 50%, and then I think another 10% is your, this is of the overall project, is your user study. So it is important that you actually do user studies because that's 10% of the full project grade. So are there questions about the project?
User studies. Do those
Yeah.
need to be done for the final project, like final presentation, or just for the final project?
Like, is it gonna be part of the presentation?
Yeah, it should be part of the presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and there really isn't much, I guess, after the final presentation really. So yeah, it would be good to have them in the presentation. Other questions? We'll talk about this more on Thursday too. Okay. So last time we talked about designing and conducting user studies. So this is a between subjects versus within subjects study. And we just went over all of this for the quiz, but this is the difference between what we were calling a usability evaluation and a user study, with a user study being something that tends to be more formal, more experimentally designed, and is meant to be published and used in a broader way, where a usability study might be for a specific product and it's just used to make that product better. So we had an example of a usability evaluation, some questions we might ask about this smart nightlight app. Can the user turn the light on or off? Can they set the color? We talked about an experimental example. So we had 2 different versions of the interface, and we would compare those to see how long it takes the user to do a task in each version. We briefly discussed some behavioral measures, like heat maps for tracking where people are interacting with the interface. And then we also talked about some things like eye tracking. So today we'll talk about analyzing data from user studies. And that's where we are on that. So the main thing to think about when you're designing your study and then looking at the data that you get from the study, you want to know what the goal is. So what's the question that you're asking? What's the thing that you need to collect data on? So for usability testing, it tends to be that we want to identify good and bad aspects of an interface, things that are working, things that aren't working. We might also want to characterize just how a user is interacting with the system. And we'll talk about this in the next slide, formative versus summative evaluations. So formative evaluations usually happen early on in the design process, whereas summative evaluations happen later. They're kind of validations. And so that's usability testing. In terms of user studies, usually we want to identify and better characterize some difference between 2 groups, 2 interfaces, two or more different things. And we want to manipulate things. So we want to give one group of people this interface and another group this other interface. And we want to see how that affects the interaction. So formative versus summative. This is something I realized I didn't put into our previous lectures, but this is just some pretty common vocabulary that's used when we talk about this. A formative evaluation, this is usually early in the design process. It's more informal. It's something where you might sit down with a user and show them a low fidelity prototype and have them, tell you, well, what is it missing, or what do they like about it, or what ideas do they have, or does it meet their needs? And this kind of shapes what you're going to design. So it's more focused on exploration. So a kind of a rough form of that is when you do your presentations to FedEx, the first 2 checkpoints. Those have been more formative evaluations. They've looked at your prototypes and what you've presented, and they've offered feedback on that. A summative evaluation is what you'll be doing with your user studies. So this happens later in development, so most of your design decisions have already been made. And what you're doing here is you're running people through your system with specific tasks and things you can measure and seeing if they're able to accomplish those things and kind of characterizing that. So it's more of a validation study. So one thing to think about is what kind of data you'll have. So there are a number of different books that I've referenced throughout today's lecture. This one's pretty good in terms of giving you just an overview of all the different types of things that are common to measure and how to analyze them. And we'll go through them at a high level. And you can find all of these books on the internet or in your library, whichever you prefer. But, so we talked about quantitative and qualitative data. And so let's just talk about a few of these in detail. So, for example, we talked about rating scales or Likert scales. Basically, this is where you give kind of a question and then, you know, a scale of either, you know, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10, whatever you want to do, and you usually anchor it. Like in this case, it's strongly disagree and strongly agree, or your two anchors here. So, you know, you'll ask someone if they would struggle to use the interface or something like that, and you know, how much do they agree with this statement or disagree with this statement. So once you run something like this, you know, you're going to get basically for each participant, you're going to get a numeric response for each of the items they responded to. From there, you can do something simple. So this is an example from the book. And so in this case, this is one of a 1 to 5 scale that they're using. And they're comparing two websites. So that's the red and the blue here. You may not be comparing two. You may just be looking at one. But all they're doing is using a bar chart to show you on each of these, you know, tasks that you need to accomplish on the website, how people rated them. So that's just one way to visualize it. But obviously, when you do a scale like this where you've put numbers to the scale, you can take those out and look at each item and calculate, you know, kind of the statistics that you would expect. And we'll talk about calculating those in a minute. So another common thing to measure is either a binary success or a levels of success approach. So the idea here is that you can come up with a task, like in the smart night light, it was turn the light on, right? So it's binary. Either they turned it on or they didn't turn it on. And the idea is that you do that across a bunch of participants, and then you get basically the rate of success. You know, how many out of the total were able to do this thing. And you can do that for a number of tasks, but you might not want to do just binary. So for some things that are more complicated than just turning on the nightlight, you might want to characterize the way that the user responded to this. So like in this example, we've got a couple of different tasks like login, search, find a book, add to cart, checkout. And instead of just saying, could the user do this or not, it's characterized by did they have, you know, no problem, some problem, or just a complete failure of being able to do this. And in a lot of cases, you'll also want to keep track of what kind of problem it was that the user encountered. So you'll probably also want to decide when you're setting up, you know, your evaluation and your task that you're going to give them, how long will you let somebody sit there and not be able to figure it out before you intervene? What will you do if they ask for help? You kind of need to have a standardized approach to this usually. But this is a good way of looking at this, is kind of either success, failure, or the level of success on a specific task. So here's another example of that. In this case, they're comparing two designs, red and blue, and looking at just the number of usability issues between the two designs. So you could even do this between like your mobile interface and your desktop interface. That might be interesting. So this is characterizing the types of task failure, and these are just a few of them. So in some cases, a participant might just give up. They might go beyond a predefined time period. So you might say if it takes them a minute to log in, then they're probably not going to figure out how to log in after a minute of sitting there. They might just do something wrong and assume they did it right. So you kind of need to note that. So another thing you can look at is the time that it takes to complete a task rather than just complete or not complete. And so there are different ways to visualize that. So obviously what you can do is just take, the task, line them up, and show how long each task took. This isn't always, incredibly meaningful, so you probably want to arrange your tasks in a way that makes sense. And especially if you want to compare between interfaces, you'll want to cluster similar tasks next to each other. So another way to look at this is you can take like a threshold cutoff, and you can say, what percentage of participants were able to do this in less than a minute. And so that can be a helpful way of looking at it. That might also be helpful for whoever's using the software if they have a goal of how efficient they want someone to be at using the software. You're getting a meaningful number there. Another thing to look at, error rates. So this is looking between conditions, but this could very well be between different interfaces. And this is just comparing how many errors are made. So you can do this by, you could count the number of mistakes made. So like clicking on the wrong thing might count as a mistake. But you need to kind of define all of that up front in your protocol so you know what you're counting as a mistake and what you're counting as a success or just something that's incidental that you don't care about. So that's all kind of behavioral stuff when you're actually using an interface or using or responding to a survey. We also discussed behavioral measures in terms of either a heat map of where a cursor is or eye tracking of where someone's looking. So in that case, you usually get your output of that is basically going to be like the amount of time spent in different areas of the screen. And so typically you'll divide the screen into kind of meaningful areas. And then you can present kind of a visual like this, this is kind of a tile heat map almost. There are a lot of different ways to present this. But basically you want to convey, where people are active in your interface, something like this. Kind of another interesting behavioral measure I thought I would just share that I saw in the book. This is a pressure-sensitive mouse, and essentially what they were doing is having people use the interface, and they're measuring the pressure applied to the mouse the entire time. And so then they've overlaid, this isn't what the user sees, but essentially this line gets thicker and then eventually gets red and thicker the more pressure that the person is applying to the mouse. So it's kind of a visual of user frustration as it unfolds. And so you can see they're trying to target the dialogue here. But so this is something you could do as well. It's basically kind of recording the input that's going on. And if it can also be useful, and if you can, I would recommend this. Whenever you're doing your user studies, just run a screen capture while the participant's interacting with it. This can often help you if you forget to actually measure something in code, or if you forget to observe directly and do it, you'll at least have a recording you can go back to and analyze. And it's also helpful if you don't have any other way to record events, because it'll be in a video, it'll be at a time code, and you'll be able to measure the time between things. And you can also replay it, so that's good. So when we talk about qualitative data, so this can be a little bit more difficult. I'd encourage you to include at least one opportunity for people in your user study to just give you open-ended, free response about using your interface. It can be hard to to get meaningful data out of an open-ended response. And certainly if you're doing it for like an actual a research study and you need statistical reliability, what you have to do is you have to take the text of what they responded, and you have to have a number of people evaluate it using some coding scheme to decide what they mean or what they're talking about, and then kind of statistically analyze that. I wouldn't expect you to do that for your projects or anything, but it certainly is kind of the standard approach that you'll find if you're looking at research. In this case, this is kind of just a fun thing, but it's helpful as well. It's just a word cloud. So this is just taking all of the responses that people gave. It's counting the frequency of the words in that response, and it's just proportionally drawing the more frequent words larger. And so this can provide some basic insight to the user experience, but it's not. It doesn't necessarily give you a prescriptive comparison or a guide on what to do with your interface. But it can be helpful. And I should say that just interviewing and talking to people can also be very helpful in identifying problems with the interface or changes you can make that would be helpful. So you may not always get that just from observing, timing things, and doing self-report surveys, but talking to someone can often give you quite a bit of insight. So, statistics. Because we're doing user evaluations and not studies, the burden of statistics is not very high for us for the project. So what we want to focus on is what we would consider descriptive statistics, which is basically saying, we timed everyone doing this action on the interface. Here's the average amount of time it took. Here's the median amount of time. You want to talk about the distribution that you found. And so things like mean, mode, median, those are all measures of central tendency. So in some cases, an average or a mean is the best way to explain something, but in some cases it's not. So if you have extreme outliers, so for example, a classic example is if you look at the distribution of a person's income, you'll find, like in the United States, that at the super high end, you have a few people with really super high incomes. Then you have some middle area, and then you have some super low incomes. It can be the case if you take an average that those people with the super high incomes will give you a much higher average number that's not representative at all of what most people have as an income. So in that case, the median makes more sense, so the middle of the data if you're to sort it in order. This is a book, Discovering Statistics Using R. There's also a version for SPSS, which is another stats software package. This is probably the best stats book that I've encountered. It's very well written. It is enjoyable to read. It's pretty humorous as well. If you need to do any kind of involved stats later, having to do with users and studies and things like this, this is a good place to start. You don't need any background in stats, and it is from a more of a psych perspective, so kind of a traditional research perspective. This is not engineering stats or anything, so it's definitely helpful for kind of applying it to things like HCI, where we are concerned about people and that kind of interaction. So moving beyond descriptives, if you have two variables or more that are happening together, you can start to look at the relationship between those variables, so just correlations. So if you think about plotting something out, one variable versus another, maybe something as simple as like height and weight, there's going to be a relationship there in most cases, right? It's not always meaningful, so sometimes there are correlations between things that are not related at all, or they may be related through some third factor that you don't observe. So to be careful with correlations. And definitely correlations do not imply that one thing caused the other to happen. Typically with a correlation, it could go either way, or it could not even be that the two things are directly related. So that's kind of the next level. You don't really have to do that for your user studies. You might run into cases where you find something interesting that's correlated. So you may do something with that. Kind of the next level and kind of the standard in terms of if you're actually running a user study is to compare groups within the study. And you're going to need to do this using pretty robust statistical tests that account for the way that distributions are, if things are normal, if certain assumptions are met. Stats is a really a messy and controversial thing, I should say, especially in the research world. So everyone has an opinion of what's right, and it is it can be tough to convince people that the method you're using is appropriate, even when it is. So if you're doing user studies, and especially in the academic world, you really have to have a solid foundation and understanding of your stats. And it's much more than we could ever cover in here. It's like, several courses worth of this that you would need to look at. But it's important, and that's where kind of like designing your protocols and everything in advance becomes super important, because when you run these stats, they have to be meaningful, and you need them to not just be noisy data that doesn't really get you anything. So what I think will be most helpful for your user studies, and which usually most helpful when you start to investigate data and try to get actual meaning from it, is to visualize it in some way. So graphs are really helpful. And so they can really inform your understanding of what's going on. So looking at just a bunch of numbers typically or computing something on those numbers is not usually as helpful as actually plotting something out and trying to gain an intuitive understanding of it. We've talked about Edward Tuff's books before. So these are really good kind of, the gold standard of information about how to visualize data. And I definitely suggest those. If you want something just quicker, the subreddit Data is Beautiful is a great subreddit. You should check that out. A lot of interesting things, but a lot of great visualizations and a lot of explanations of how people created the visualizations and where they got the data. And so I'd recommend looking just at other people's visualizations to get kind of inspiration for what you want to do. But it's definitely something that's important and that's helpful in gaining an understanding of what the data actually means. There is a downside to this, so visuals can be pretty misleading if you want them to be, and we'll look at some examples in just a second. So you do have to be careful about how you're presenting data. And so let's see. Oh, I included some simple visualizations. Okay. So these are, and I know you can't read that, but these are just really simple things. Like this is plotted in Excel. And so what this is this is my energy usage over time for my apartment. And so like, I don't know, whatever utility company, I think it's like 4 County, I don't know what it is. But they provide you pretty detailed data actually on their website. If you're willing to hack a little bit in the JavaScript, you can download all of this data. And so this is showing energy usage. But immediately you can see some interesting things like here, and here, and here. And you can't read what dates those are, but you want to take a guess what time of year the energy usage just goes way down? What?
Those holidays.
Yeah. So all of these dips are winter breaks. So I'm not here. So it dips way down, right? And then some of this you can see is seasonal, right? So if I were to plot the temperature out with it, that would track really well. But you can even see like spring break probably happening in there. So this is really simple. It's just one one measure here. It's just the kilowatts, each day that are used, plotted over time. But immediately you're getting some interesting information. So here's another one that I pulled that's from my data. And so this is a plot of my GPA over semesters. And so I've got 3 different versions of it because I've transferred between schools and things. So in some cases, like your GPA resets when you transfer somewhere, but I wanted to see what it would be if it didn't. So like you can see some interesting stuff from this data. So like the blue is just the semester itself and what the GPA was there. And then the orange is a running GPA. And so you can see like, what happens when you have a bad semester and you start to really get pulled down there. And you can't get back out. But anyways, so, but you can tell like there's a clear, dip here in what happened. So this is where I got involved with research for the first time and started spending more time in the lab than in class. So grades go down. But then you realize you have to bring them back up. So, I mean, these are simple things, but they tell a story, and there's, meaning behind the data. Now, whether you can tease it out or not is another question. But those are really simple examples, and these are just like plotted in Excel. For the stuff you're going to do in your user studies, I don't think you'll need anything more complicated than like Excel or Google Docs or whatever you want to use. If you want to do, some real stats, I do recommend R. It is a good stats package, and it's not a great programming language, I'll tell you that, but it is a really good stats package, and it has a ton of stuff available in the community and a ton of support, so that's nice, and it's free. You don't have to pay for it. Okay, so let's talk about some of the misleading graphics. So I was looking for some examples, and like all of the real examples of like things that newspapers had done and stuff were like really low quality, and like they were a lot of JPEG. So surprisingly, this random website had some pretty good examples, just at a high level, of some deceptive practices and things that you should not do. So one bad thing that you could do is to omit the baseline. So if we show this graph, it looks like there's quite a big difference between these groups, but notice that we started at 50 here. Whereas if we would have started at 0, the difference is not really as much visually. So if you were just looking at the numbers, it's fine. It's the same numbers, right? But if you're going to present this, this definitely conveys something different than this when you present it to people. And this is part of the reason that, when you're doing research level user studies, they care a lot about the stats that you do because the statistical test would tell you that these are pretty much not any different from each other, probably. And they're just a way of doing that so that the visual does not lie to you so much. But another thing that you can do to play with the visualization and make it quite misleading is to adjust the axis. So in this case, we've just kind of added this ceiling here to make the overall deviations kind of compressed, basically. And so it's one thing when you do this to decide, kind of what your, like in this case, what your y-axis will be. It needs to be something that's meaningful, that's grounded in whatever you're measuring. So if you were measuring the time it takes a user to do a task, and you would set like a maximum of like 60 seconds, maybe your scale should be 0 to 60, right? And also, I should say it's very important, if you were to do that for like 2 different user groups, and you were to show graphs of each group next to each other, you need to make sure the y-axis is the same scale on both of them. Otherwise, that could be really misleading to look at. Here's another one that's pretty obvious that can cause problems. So if there's data that doesn't support your theory or isn't helping you out any, just kind of throw it away and then take the data that works for you. In this case, it's just like cut it off right here, right? And it looks pretty good. But obviously, these are two very different stories. And so it's definitely miscommunicates what's going on. Using the wrong visualization can be pretty bad. So I'm sure we have all at some times or another seen a pie chart that does not add up to 100%, or doesn't make sense to even use a pie chart in a situation. So you really have to make sure that the form that you're choosing for representing something is logical and makes sense. And I mean, honestly, a lot of things, just doing a plot or a bar graph is a pretty good way to get started, and usually will not cause you any trouble. It's when you kind of start to try to force things into things that don't naturally make sense for them that you run into these kinds of problems. One last one here, just going against common conventions. So in this case, the shading is inverted, basically. So, and this is I should say a social construct, a cultural construct. It just so happens that we usually do things this way, right? Where density is a darker color as the density increases. That may not always be the case, but it's something to think about. Because people may be very primed to think of something in one way, you don't want to deceive them or lead them by accident by choosing a convention that's at odds with what the norm is. Okay, so just kind of want to give you an example outline of what you probably want to do for your user evaluation. So obviously you'll want to take the interface that you have and choose what you want to evaluate. So look at it, look at some features, probably try to choose the things that were either most interesting to you. If you have a question about something like, will this perform well, or you have two alternative designs, that's definitely something you should choose to evaluate. But you want to pick a few things. It doesn't have to be a ton of things. You probably want the people in your user study to spend like 10 minutes or less doing this, unless you just have really dedicated friends or participants who are going to do this. And you'll want to choose the things that you want to evaluate and write up kind of how you're going to do that. So it might be that we're going to time how long it takes them to do each task, or we're going to see if they make mistakes doing the task, or if they're able to do it without help, or how many times they have to ask for help. It might be something like that. And what you'll want to do is at least once before you bring in anybody to, take part in your study or your evaluation, try it out yourself, you and your team members, just to make sure you're recording all the data you need to record and that it makes sense. So in terms of recording data, if you can, I recommend adding code. So if you can just add code that timestamps, like the user clicked here, they completed this task, whatever, and save that out, that's definitely the easiest because it automates that process of collecting it. If you don't want to spend time doing that, or you can't do that with the system that you're using, you can always directly observe what the participant's doing and roughly get a time estimate, whether that be with a stopwatch or just estimating it. But you can also do screen recordings. That's a good way to do it because then you can go back later and look and get the exact timing. But you want to be sure that you record all of that data somehow. And eventually, you'll want to move it to a standardized format. So it'll be going to a spreadsheet probably, where you kind of have like a row for each person and then a column for each thing that you're measuring typically. Whenever you do like a survey, if you're going to do like a usability scale or something at the end usually about the overall system, It's usually pretty easy. You can use like, I think SurveyMonkey is free to use for the most part. You can definitely use Google Forms if you want, and it'll just populate a Google Sheet for you. And that's usually a pretty easy way to do that. So they're just, real easy templated surveys that you can create quickly. And then someone can just fill them out on the computer. The data's all there. You don't have to have paper or transcribe it or anything like that. So once you have all of that data, you're going to want to look through it for anything that's just really weird. So, if you were expecting like a value between 0 and 60 seconds and you get like a value that's like -2 million for, whatever, something probably went wrong somewhere. Something overflowed, something wasn't captured right. You want to make sure that you don't just blindly, you produce a chart or run an analysis on data that doesn't make any sense at all for the context that you're in. And you want to kind of clean your data up in terms of getting it in a nice format that you can present and that you can distribute. Please don't, and I'll put this in the project requirements, if you collect information that is identifiable to an individual who is in your user evaluation, please don't include that data in anything you turn in or present. So you don't have to do any IRB or ethical stuff because this is a classroom activity, but just kind of, don't send people's data all over the world if it's not something that's just about the interface. So once you've got it all cleaned up, you get it in some kind of data format, then you can start to do visualizations and kind of explore what's going on with the data and decide what you want to present. So you probably won't want to present all of it. Usually what you want to present is, first of all, who did the study. So kind of just a snapshot. It's usually going to be like, people that I knew, and most of them are between this age, it's usually college age, and maybe all of them were CS majors, or maybe all but a few were CS majors, or maybe none of them were CS majors. That's something that's relevant, usually, just to kind of give a feel for who was evaluating the system, because that can matter. And if you have a lot of time, you should like try it with older people and younger people and see if there's a difference or something. That can be fun as well. So once you've got that, you start to visualize things, find the interesting stuff, and in your presentation, you want to pick usually the most interesting things. There are a lot of things that will just kind of confirm what you expected, and so maybe those aren't the most interesting to present. Sometimes they are. But when you interpret things and you're getting them ready to present, you do want to take a moment. If it's something that's not incredibly direct, before you ascribe meaning to the data, try to think of any possible alternative to the thing you're thinking is the reason behind something that could explain it. So you have to be careful just in your interpretation. If there's any room for multiple possibilities for something, for the reason that something happened, to be sure to include that in your presentation. Be sure to acknowledge that it's possible this was caused by that, but we weren't able to measure whatever, so we don't know for sure. This is less likely to occur kind of just in a basic evaluation, but definitely occurs a lot in more involved studies. So you guys have questions about your user evaluations, user studies?
How many people do you expect us to get?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So there's no set number. I would say at least 10 is what I would aim for. Higher is typically better. Probably not hundreds. That would probably be a waste. But 10 plus is what I think is reasonable, which is kind of, I think you guys have 5 people in a group, so 2 people each average. So obviously you can't evaluate it, like you're not eligible yourself, but anyone you know or can trap for 10 minutes to do this is reasonable. And I'll include that on the little write-up that says what to do. Other questions? Okay. Good deal. Next time we will talk about social HCI. and we'll have a quiz on analyzing data.